Shalom Aleichem, Mishpachim. All right, we are continuing with the Torah portion, the book of Leviticus, with the Torah portion of Leviticus, Vayikra, and this is Onkelos on the Torah. Let us begin. We are in the fifth Torah reading, the fifth Aliyah, which is chapter 4, verse 1 through 26. Torah up here, Onkelos down here. Here we go, verse 1, Torah. The Lord spoke with Moses, saying, "Speak with the Israelites, saying, when a person trespasses unwittingly against any of the commandments of the Lord, those that are not proper to do any of them, or if the anointed priest trespasses, bringing blame upon the people, he must offer for the trespass of which he is guilty an unblemished young bull of the herd before the Lord as a guilt offering." Verse 1, Onkelos. The Lord spoke. Chapters 4 and 5 contain laws concerning sacrifices designed to secure atonement and forgiveness for unwittingly committed offenses. The individual did not know, for example, the biblical law that certain animal fats are prohibited foods, or he knew the law but mistook a forbidden fat for one that is permitted. The transgressions of different people are addressed. The common Israelite, the tribal leader, a common priest, the anointed priest, and the community at large. The sacrifice brought by each was different. The person having the higher office and presumably committing a transgression of greater impact was required to offer a more significant and expensive sacrifice. The two chapters do not specify all the offenses that mandated the sacrifices. The rabbis addressed this lacuna in various books of the oral law. Onkelos does not add this information. There are two principal types of expiatory sacrifices. The chatat, which is the sin, and the asham, which is the guilt. Onkelos also fails to define these nouns, and scholars differ in how they describe them. With the biblical terminology in this context is two. All of the Aramaic targums, including the Targum of the Samaritan Bible, replace the somewhat dictatorial to with the more respectful conversational with in this chapter's first two verses. Verse 2, Onkelos, person. Scripture's nefesh is translated soul in modern Hebrew, but meant person or life force in biblical times, and is so translated by our Targumist and the Sa'adi Agon. See commentary on chapter 2, verse 1. Sifra suggests that the Hebrew includes non-Jews and even servants, who are also people. Nevertheless, Nachmanides reads the modern meaning into the biblical word and argues that the Bible purposely restricted itself to nefesh to indicate that sin emanates from thoughts in the soul and blemishes it. Trespasses. Our Targumist inserts chov, which is trespass or mistake or guilt, when scripture's chatat and asham are verbs, but retains a form of the biblical Hebrew when the words are nouns. He also uses chov for avon, which is a synonym. The rabbis explain that one must offer a guilt offering, a chatat. I thought chatat was a sin offering. Guilt is asham, for an unwitting trespass committed in violation of a biblical negative commandment, for which, if committed intentionally, he would require lashes, makot, or excision, karet, which is the death by hand of heaven. Based on the Babylonian Talmud, keritot. The commandments of the Torah, the Pentateuch, uses the construct form mitzvot, the Lord's commands, which our Targumist replaces with the non-construct grammatical form, as if it had been written hamitzvot shel, the commands of the Lord. He frequently, but not always, avoids placing the construct form into his translation. In this chapter, he substitutes the following for the biblical construct: the blood of, in verses 5, 7, 16, 25, and 34. The curtain of in verse 7, the bull of in verse 8 and 20, the altar of in verse 10, 25, and 30, the community of in verse 13, the commandments of in verse 2, 13, 22, and 27, the base of in verse 18, 30, and 34, the horns of in verse 25 and 34, the place of in 29, and the sacrifice of in 35. Since this is more of a technical than a substantive alteration, and since it occurs so frequently, and since we decided not to burden our readers by identifying every one of the hundreds of times that our Targumist inserts of and the, we will point out several instances where it occurs in this chapter, but we will generally not comment upon these changes in the future. Not proper to do. The Aramaic supplies proper to, which the Hebrew implies to enhance the clarity of the passage. The inserted word kashrin is a form of kosher, and the original meaning of kosher was fit or proper. This clarifying insertion is quite commonplace. It is also inserted, for example, in verses 13, 22, and 27. To do any of them. The Bible in Onkelos literally read this as, and does from one from them. The English word from is the single letter mem in Hebrew. Chazkuni informs us that the mem attached to one is superfluous because it is properly attached to the next word. From them. This phenomenon of a superfluous mem occurs frequently in the Bible, although Onkelos frequently eliminates grammatically superfluous letters. It retained the mem. The Saadia Gaon eliminated it in his Arabic translation. Rashi and Sifra followed the interpretive method of Rabbi Akiva and did not believe that any words or letters are superfluous in the Torah. Accordingly, the two found a purpose for from, a halachic ruling, if a person transgresses even from one. That is, even against a part of a negative commandment, he would be obligated to bring a guilt offering. Verse 3. I'll read verse 3 again in Torah. I'll start with verse 1 again. The Lord spoke with Moses, saying, Speak with the Israelites, saying, When a person trespasses unwittingly against any of the commandments of the Lord, those that are not proper to do any of them, or if the anointed priest trespasses, bringing blame upon the people, he must offer for the trespass of which he is guilty an unblemished young bull of the herd before the Lord as a guilt offering. Verse 3. Onkelos, anointed priest. The biblical term anointed priest appears only in chapters 4, 5, and 6. The leading or senior priest was called the priest during the monarchical period, as in 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 10, and the chief priest or high priest after the exile, as in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, verse 20, and Haggai chapter 1, verse 1, and Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1. In chapter 21, verse 10, the term Hagadol is used to describe the anointed priest as being exalted above his fellows, but he is not given the title high priest there. In our verse, since Aaron and his sons were anointed, it could refer to any of them. However, Sifra, Leviticus Rabbah, and other rabbinical sources understand this section to be speaking of the senior priest alone. Trespasses, blame, trespass, guilty, guilt offering. Scripture uses a form of chatat and asham for these 5 terms. Blame upon the people. This Hebrew phrase, which Onkelos renders literally, can be understood in different ways. Among others, it could be if the anointed priest trespasses in the same way as one of the people, or if he rendered an improper decision and misled the people to act improperly, even if he himself did not act unsuitably. Rashi understands that the anointed priest's personal transgression affects the people because they are dependent upon him to make atonement for them and to pray for them, and he has become impaired and unable to perform this act properly. More practically, Rashbam states that when the anointed priest, who is supposed to be the expert in the law, errs, he thereby misleads and harms the people. In his commentary to verse 3, Bechor Shchor states that there is no distinction between a commoner and a king, or priest in respect to idol worship. All Israelites of any rank who trespass and worship an idol are treated equally. For as Proverbs chapter 21, verse 30 declares, there is no greatness, wisdom, or understanding against the Lord. 4. The Bible in Onkelos terminology, al, literally on. Chazkuni clarifies that the preposition should be understood as for. Young bull. The designation ben, bakar, signifies the acceptable age of the bull, which must be 3 years old. The term is also used for a similar reason in chapter 1, verse 14, Bene Yonah. Since the anointed priest was the most elevated person bringing sacrifices, he had to offer the most elevated offering for a trespass, a young bull, before The Aramaic softened scriptures anthropomorphic to the Lord, which could lead to masses to think that God is handed the sacrifice, like a tribute given to the king. By using kadam, before, meaning before. Verse 4 and verse 5. Torah. He brings the bull to the tent of meeting, entrance before the Lord. He says, he lays his hand on the bull's head and slaughters the bull before the Lord. The anointed priest takes some of the blood of the bull and brings it into the tent of meeting. All right, verse 4 and 5. Before, unlike verse 3, where the Bible has to the Lord, this passage has lifnei, the Hebrew equivalent of the Aramaic kadam, before. Our Targumist treats the first lifnei as le kadam, as in chapter 2, verse 8, and chapter 7, verse 29, and elsewhere. The second lifnei is translated kadam. See commentary on chapter 2, verse 8. The two usages were probably sparked by the Targumist's desire not to repeat words frequently, especially not when they are in close proximity. The location referred to as before the Lord is the northern part of the altar. Hand. The Bible's singular is retained despite it being contrary to the halakha, which require both hands to be placed on the bull's head. Anointed priest, see commentary in verse 3, takes. The biblical terminology is lakach, ankelos yisav. The Targumist translates lakach either as dabar, as in Exodus chapter 10, verse 13, and chapter 21, verse 14, and other verses, or yisav, as in Genesis chapter 24, verse 4, and chapter 34, 16, and 34, 17, and elsewhere. The former implies a taking against one's will, while yisav suggests a consensual joint undertaking, and is appropriate in the passage, and, for example, to describe a marriage as in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 13. The blood of. The Bible has the construct form. See commentary in verse 2. Tent of meeting. This is another name for the tabernacle. Verse 6. Torah. The priest dips his finger into the blood and sprinkles some of the blood 7 times before the Lord, before the curtain of the sanctuary. The priest places some of the blood on the horns of the altar of aromatic incense before the Lord in the tent of meeting. All the rest of the blood of the bull he spills out at the base of the altar of the burnt offering, which is in the tent of meeting entrance. Verse 6 and 7. Unkelos, verse 6. Dips, sprinkles 7 times. Each sprinkling required a dipping, for a total of 7 dippings. The commentators note that the number 7 occurs frequently in Judaism. 7 days of the week, 7 weeks counted to Shavuot. The 7th month is Rosh Hashanah, 7 years in the sabbatical year, 7 sabbatical years in the Jubilee. The holidays of Passover and Sukkot are 7 days. There were 7 branches on the candelabrum. Balaam built 7 altars in Numbers chapter 23, etc. It can also be said that the holidays of Sukkot and Chag HaMatzot, the feast of the unleavened bread, occur on the night of the 14th day of the month, which is twice 7, and the Passover offering was brought on the 14th day of the month. Other cultures including pre-biblical civilizations, also use the number 7 repeatedly. Before, Scripture has et penei, literally the face, in verses 6 and 17. It could be the direct object of the sprinkling and mean, sprinkle the face of the curtain, or be a figure of speech denoting direction, before. Sifra, our Targumist, and the Saadia Gaon and Rashi understood this the second way. Rashi states that if the blood that was sprinkled in front of the curtain happened to touch the curtain itself, the blood would not invalidate the offering. The curtain of the sanctuary, Onkelos, replaces the biblical construct form. See commentary in verse 2. The sanctuary consisted of 2 parts that were separated by a curtain. See chapter 1, verse 3. The purpose of the curtain was to conceal the Holy of Holies from public view. The Holy of Holies could only be entered by the anointed priest on Yom Kippur after special preparations. Verse 7, Onkelos, horns. The Aramaic has the same root as the Hebrew horns, but the Saadia Gaon translated as corners. The altar's design is described in Exodus chapter 30, verse 34 through chapter 38. All the rest of the blood. Right here. The Bible and Onkelos have it as kol adam, which literally means all of the blood. This is not possible since, as we just read, some of the blood is sprinkled before the curtain. Therefore, Sifra and the Saadia Gaon and Rashi clarify the phrase by modifying it to the rest of the blood. The Bible, which Rabbi Ishmael states speaks in human language, often employs a synecdoche, using the whole to refer to a part. Whatever this word says. The synecdoche can be the whole referring to a part or a part for the whole, or uses hyperbole, perhaps to emphasize a point or say it in a more interesting fashion. Compare verse 13, where entire also does not mean all. The blood of the base of the altar. The Targumist replaces Scripture's construct form. See commentary on verse 2. Altar of the burnt offering. The altar was named after the burnt offering that was sacrificed on it daily. In. The Targum supplies the implied preposition in, as it does in verses 18 in chapter 1, verse 5, and many other places to help clarify the passage. Verse 8 and 9, Torah. All the fat from the bowl of the guilt offering he separates from it, the fat that covers the entrails and all the fat that is attached to the entrails. Verse 9, Torah. He removes the two kidneys and the fat that is on them, that is on the flanks, and the diaphragm that is over the liver on the kidneys. Verse 8, Onkelos, the bowl of the guilt offering. Here, again, the Bible uses the construct. See commentary in verse 2. Separates. The biblical terminology is yarim. Here and in verse 10. See commentary in chapter 2, verse 9. He must separate the fat before the bowl is cut up. Verse 9, he removes. See commentary in chapter 3, verse 4. Verses 10, Torah, and 11. It is the same as what is separated from the holy sacrifice. The priest burns them on the altar of the burnt offering. He takes the bull's hide and all of its flesh on the head and on the legs, its entrails and its dung. Verse 12. He removes the entire bull outside the camp to the clean place, to a place in the deposit area of the ashes, and burns it on the wood with fire. It shall be burned in a place in the deposit area of the ashes. Verse 12. Verse 10, it is the same. Biblical understanding is ka'asher, literally, as. Onkelos typically uses the more explicit ke-ma-de. It is the same, as in. Verses 20, 21, 31, and 35. Separated. See commentary on chapter 2, verse 9. Holy sacrifice. Biblical terminology in this context, in this verse, is shalamim sacrifice. See commentary in chapter 3, verse 1. The altar of. Scripture has the construct. Verse 11. Onkelos. He takes. The verb is missing in Scripture and the Targum. On. The biblical understanding is al, literally on. Onkelos retains the biblical word, but Rashi explains that it implies in addition to. Verse 12, outside the camp. As on the holiday of Yom Kippur, the purification process consisted of a sacrifice on the altar and the taking of something outside the camp. In the wilderness, this meant beyond the three camps. The tabernacle area surrounded by the Levites, surrounded by the Israelites. In the land of Israel, it meant outside of the city of Jerusalem, not just outside the temple. Both phrases, outside the camp and to the clean place, are instructive. The first is directional, stating that the bull's hide must be burned outside the camps of Jerusalem. The second concerns the issue of respect for what was once holy, that these unused items must be removed to a clean place, a site where the ashes from the altar were buried, and not an unclean place such as a human burial ground, or where the stones, wood, and clay of a house that was afflicted with tsarat, historically often mistranslated as leprosy, were placed, as prescribed in chapter 14, verse 45. Why was it necessary to take the items outside the camp? Some sages see the removal as a substitution. The cast off item is a substitute for the people, who are now cleansed and no longer need to be eliminated. Others see the removal as a symbolic moral act. It teaches the people that they should rid themselves of their improper behavior. Place. The Targumist fails to differentiate the ash heap outside the camp from the place of ashes near the altar of the burnt offering. and only introduces the single word atar, which is place, from chapter 1, verse 16, twice, to enhance the clarity of the verse with an implied noun. Area. The Aramaic inserts beit, meaning area or house, twice, as in Genesis chapter 13, verse 10. Well-watered area, and Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 11, area of his shame, and many other places. There is a subtle distinction between beit and atar, mentioned in the prior commentary. The former is a construct noun, literally the area of, and focuses on the activity performed at the site where one deposits ashes. In contrast, atar spotlights the place where the activity is performed. Verse 13, Torah, down here. If the entire community of Israelites errs, and the matter escapes the community's notice, so that they violate any of the commandments of the Lord, those that are not proper to do, they are culpable. Verse 14, when the trespass that they committed becomes known, the community must offer a bull of the herd as a guilt offering and bring it before the tent of meeting. Verse 13, and this is Onkelos, entire community of Israelites. While Onkelos is literal, the Saadia Gaon understands entire community as an exaggerated statement that describes the error of only a group of Israelites. Sifra identifies the group as the Sanhedrin, the judicial court of 71 members. Since there was no Sanhedrin during the biblical age, the word is Greek. Sifra probably means the tribal leaders. See also verse 7, where all does not mean all. The phrase community of Israelites is another example of a Targumic avoidance of a biblical construct form. In this case, Israelite community. Israelite community. See commentary on verse 2. The Hebrew term Eda, which is community, derives from Yad, to meet. The same root that is in Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, and Moed, an annual festival. The Targum literally reads, and it shall be that the matter escapes the meaning of the added word, Ve'yehe. Of all of the Targums insert the word frequently into their translation for the sake of clarity. It is implied and unnecessary in the Hebrew. Examples of its inclusion in the Aramaic can be seen in chapter 5, verse 2. I will not read that. The commandments of. This is another biblical construct. See commentary in verse 2. Proper to do, as in verse 2, the Targum inserts proper to. Verse 14, Torah. When the trespass that they committed becomes known, the community must offer a bull of the herd as a guilt offering and bring it before the tent of meeting. Verse 15, Torah. The community elders lay their hands upon the bull's head before the Lord, and he slaughters the bull before the Lord. Verse 14, trespass, committed, guilt offering. The biblical Hebrew is ha-chatat, chato, le-chatat. See commentary on verse 2. Becomes known. Why does Scripture state that the offering is brought when the trespass becomes known? Isn't it obvious that no sacrifice would be brought unless the community became aware that they had trespassed? Ramban uncharacteristically states that this is simply a linguistic style and nothing should be read into the superfluous language. Verse 15, Onkelos, community elders. The Hebrew term for elders is zekenim, literally older people, a concept kept in the Aramaic translation, which is literal. Like many other ancient civilizations, Judaism also has a history of leadership by a council of elders. Who were they? They are varying opinions. Three members of the Sanhedrin are the elders. Sifra, see the comment on Sanhedrin in the commentary on verse 13. The 12 tribal leaders have this leadership position, Pseudo-Jonathan. They were an unspecified number of community leaders, or an unspecified group of wise men, not necessarily in leadership role. He, both the Hebrew and Aramaic use the singular he, even though the verse is speaking about many elders. It is possible, even likely, that he here means one of them, since all of the elders could not participate in slaughtering a single animal. Verse 16 and 17, Torah. The anointed priest brings some of the blood of the bull into the tent of meeting. Verse 17, Torah. The priest dips his finger into the blood and sprinkles 7 times before the Lord, before the curtain. Verse 16. Onkelos, anointed priest. See commentary in verse 3. The blood of. Another converted biblical construct. Verse 17. Onkelos, before. Scripture reads at Penei, before the face. Verse 18 and 19, Torah. He places some of the blood on the altar horns before the Lord in the tent of meeting. He pours out all the rest of the blood at the base of the altar of the burnt offering, which is in the entrance of the tent of meeting. Verse 19, Torah. He separates all of its fat from it and burns it on the altar. Verse 18, Onkelos, the base of. Another construct. See commentary on verse 2. In the Targums, insert a bet in here. Verse 19, separates. The Bible understands it as lifts up. Verse 20, Torah. He does with this bull the same as he did with the bull of the guilt offering. He does the same with it. The priest makes atonement for them, and they are forgiven. Verse 21, Torah. He removes the bull outside the camp and burns it. This burns it the same as he burned the first bull. It is the community's guilt offering. Verse 20 and 21. Verse 20. Onkelos, the bull of the guilt offering. The Bible has the construct at and ha-chatat. See commentary verse 2. Atonement. In both the Hebrew and Aramaic versions of Leviticus, the verb, and I don't know what that is, which normally expresses the idea of expiation or atonement, has a more general meaning than usual, although scholars differ as to what it is. Some say it is to wipe clean, and others to cover over. The root carries both meanings. Forgiven, as with atonement, scholars debate the precise meaning of salach, atonement, although the consensus leans toward cleansed, as in the phrase cleansed with water. Verse 22. If the leader trespasses by violating one of the commandments of the Lord his God, those that are not proper to do, inadvertently, he incurs guilt. Verse 23, if the trespass of which he is guilty is brought to his attendant, he must bring an unblemished male goat as his offering. Verse 22 and 23. Verse 23. Onkelos, if the biblical word is spelled aleph, vav, which generally means or, but which Rashi explains sometimes has the same meaning as im, if, as it does here in Exodus chapter 21, verse 36. Onkelos retains the Hebrew word. Trespass, guilty. Trespass is chatato, guilty is chata. Male goat, the Targums add bar, the Aramaic cognate of ben, literally son. Verse 24. Torah, he lays his hand on the goat's head and slaughters it in the same place where the burnt offering is slaughtered before the Lord. It is a guilt offering. Verse 24. Onkelos, in the same place, on the northern side of the altar, in the spot specified for the Olah, in chapter 1, verse 11. It is a guilt offering, a chatat. 25, 26. The priest, verse 25, Torah, the priest takes some of the blood of the guilt offering with his finger and places it on the horns of the altar of the burnt offering. The rest of its blood is poured out at the base of the altar of the burnt offering. Verse 26, Torah, he burns all of its fat on the altar, like the fat of the holy sacrifice. Thus the priest makes atonement on his own behalf for his trespass, and he is forgiven. Verse 25 and 26. 25. Onkelos, the blood of, the horns of, the altar of. These are 3 additional constructs that Onkelos alters. See commentary in verse 2. Burnt offering. The guilt offerings of the leader and of the individual were brought to the outer altar, where the guilt offerings of the anointed priest and the community were set on the more prestigious inner altar, called the golden altar, because of the status of the priest and the community. The rest of its blood, see commentary in verse 7. altar of the burnt offering. Nachmanides observes the repetition of the name of the altar and suggests that this is a common scriptural linguistic style, as in verse 4, where bull is repeated. However, he also notes that many rabbis do not accept that the Torah speaks in the language of human beings and has a linguistic style, a conservative view that he himself generally follows, although not here or in verse 14. These rabbis, and generally Nachmanides as well, hold that since the Torah of the Lord is perfect, no word is repeated without a didactic reason. See our introduction to Exodus for the full discussion on this subject. Verse 26, Onkelos, holy sacrifice. In this context is Shelamim, peace offering. Trespass. In this context, Me Chatato. And that is the fifth Aliyah of the portion of Vayikra, in the book of Vayikra. All right, fifth reading. Perfect. 4, 1-26. I just read the fifth reading, Leviticus chapter 4, verses 1-26. This is the daily wisdom on the Parshiyot from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. They are wonderful insight to Torah, wonderful wisdom insight. All right, I'll begin. God then taught Moses the procedures for sin offerings. These sacrifices atoned principally for unintentional misdeeds. Special sin offerings are prescribed when such sins are committed by the community's leaders, the high priest, the Sanhedrin, high court, or the king. When the Sanhedrin issued an incorrect ruling that the community followed, the community had to bring a sin offering. The title of this daily wisdom on the Parshiot is called A Positive Prejudice. He must do to the bull just as he would do to the sin offering bull of the high priest. He must do this to it to atone for them so they may be forgiven. The Torah does not completely describe the details of how the sin offering brought by the community is handled, preferring instead to simply say that it should be treated the same way as the previously discussed offering. Rashi tells us that this is because God does not wish to dwell on the wrongdoings of his people. The Torah enjoins us to learn from God's example. Our love for our fellow should permeate us so thoroughly that when we do him or her a favor, we feel that we are doing it for ourselves rather than for someone else. Similarly, anything that happens to another person, good or bad, should affect us personally. And following the example in this verse, we should recoil at the very prospect of saying something deprecative, meaning something derogatory about someone else. I'm sorry I can't pronounce that word. But yeah, this is a wonderful teaching. Wonderful teaching. All right. Have a wonderful day and have a good day. Boker Tov.